Hello and welcome. We are with you at this late hour on Sunday evening because, like everybody else, there has been feverish speculation over the last 24 hours about who may have been spied upon, placed under surveillance in the world of politics, in the world of media, in the world of government. Well, we now know that an international media expose involving 16 media outlets from the Washington Post to The Wire is placing some of these names in the public domain. The Jamal Khashoggi case is also at the center stage of this, and Pegasus, the Israeli spy software, is back in the headlines. Now, of course, as we said, Jamal Khashoggi, the Saudi Arabian journalist who was assassinated, his wife was among those who was put under surveillance using this Israeli surveillance software. But here in India too, the ripples and the tremors are being felt. The Wire is reporting that 40 Indian journalists are among those whose devices may have been hacked or were sought to be hacked using this software, Pegasus. The Wire is also reporting, along with, as we said, this is an international media expose, that its own founding editors were among those who were attempted to be hacked and placed under surveillance, and that in the subsequent days they will be releasing more names, and those names include two serving ministers, a judge of the Supreme Court, a constitutional authority, and 3 opposition members. Now, of course, we don't have those names yet. There's been some rumors about who they are, but we're of course going to stay away from those names until they're actually placed in the public domain. But what we do know right now is that this is something with international repercussions, from the assassinated Jamal Khashoggi to Indian journalists here at home. And to discuss the implications of this ahead of the next session of Parliament, let's introduce our guests. On the program today, Sandeep Ghosh, commentator and columnist, is with us. Sumant Raman, welcome to the program. Also, political analyst is with us. KC Singh, still fixing his device there. Welcome, Ambassador
Yes.
KC Singh. Tehseen Poonawala, Congress supporter, political analyst, is with us. And Pranesh Prakash, who I think is the one technical expert qualified to tell us what the hell is going on here, is with us as well. And of course, the politics of this is what will play out in Parliament. But let's remind our audience that this is not the first time that Pegasus has been in the headlines. In 2019 too, there were sort of tremors in India as human rights activists at that time too were reported to be under surveillance, and Ravi Shankar Prasad, the minister at the time, said that there had been no unauthorized use of Pegasus. Pranesh, let me start by asking you to very simply tell our audience who doesn't quite know what Pegasus is, what might be going on here. Of course, the politics of it will play out, but we do know the worst kept secret has been revealed yet again, that India's journalists are under surveillance. Or could be under surveillance. Pranesh.
So Pegasus is software that's sold by an Israeli company called the NSO Group, which say that they only sell the software to vetted governments. It is a kind of malware that someone can install on your phone, and this is applicable both to iPhones and to Android phones. And once they have control of your phone, they can access various other things using it, including your SMS messages, your WhatsApp messages in some cases, and so on. So this came to light a few years ago, thanks to an organization in Canada called Citizen Lab, which found certain WhatsApp users being attacked using the software.
Yeah, and given what we know right now, and we know very little, but we do know that 40 Indian journalists, 3 opposition members, 2 serving ministers, the Wire, which is the Indian collaborator for this international media project that includes, as I said, 16 media organizations from across the world, has only listed the journalists. They include the Wire's own journalists, but they also include other journalists at newspapers like the Hindustan Times and other big networks as well, Pranesh. And actually, You can't necessarily find a pattern here, because though the wire is considered to be anti-government, there are others on this list that are in fact considered quite close to government. So it's all a bit confusing, and the question, of course, would be who ordered for this surveillance to take place, and can this surveillance take place at the level of private operators, or does it take place only at the level of sovereign nations?
So, under Indian law, legally for such surveillance to have been carried out, you need authorization by the Home Secretary, either at the union level or the state level, for any kind of interception. Now, there is no particular provision that talks about hacking being permitted, because in order for this kind of interception to take place, you need to actually place malware and contaminate someone's phone. And that itself is a criminal offense under the IT Act. No specific exemption is provided under the IT Act for such an act, under Section 66 and under Section 43 of the IT Act. So for me, it's unclear whether this would be legal. And so far, the government has not said that that this went through the proper channels or so on. They so far have not accepted or denied using Pegasus, as far as I understand.
Yeah. So Pranesh, the government, of course, has denied all allegations of surveillance, and we're going to see what names emerge over the next couple of days. But to you, what's the most important thing right now that's leaping out on what we know thus far? A lot of things are being feverishly speculated on. In 2019, when Pegasus was first in the headlines, its parent company said it doesn't outsource it to freelance operators. It's only used by governments. Can we say that with certainty anymore?
For me, that particular angle, that particular question is the wrong way to approach this. Really, for me, the question really is whether this was done under authorization of law, and if so, for the actual authorization to be made available, because the surveillance, whatever purpose it served, it was in the past. So it should be, the government should be transparent about it. If this has been used, then why it was used. And given that the forensic evidence that has been published by Amnesty International and Citizen Lab is quite compelling, it does seem to show that all of these were infected actually by Pegasus. So there doesn't really seem to be a doubt about whether it was used. Just about whether it was the Indian government, and that seems highly likely in my understanding of the situation, and whether it followed proper channels. Very importantly, the laws that we have currently in India for usage of surveillance just do not suffice, because intelligence agencies fall outside the scope of any parliamentary oversight. Intelligence agencies are directly answerable to the cabinet secretary in some cases, to the MHA in other cases, but they're not answerable to parliament. They're not answerable to the Indian public. That is something that has been raised by the vice president in the past, former vice president in the past, and was in fact, there's been a private member's bill to correct that in Parliament, but so far that has not gotten any traction. That is something that we absolutely need. And further, if you go by what the government itself has made public on surveillance in India, okay, there's a cabinet secretary press release from 2013 on this, and giving numbers suggesting more than 10,000 orders of surveillance were put through and so on. The current procedure for surveillance, which requires that the cabinet, that the Home Secretary, okay, either the Home Union or Home Secretary, actually pass such an order, and that a committee which includes the cabinet secretary actually vet that order and review it afterwards. That procedure just wouldn't be possible. If you think about it, it should take at least 5 minutes to review any particular application, and if you have 10,000 of them to go through in 365 days, you do the math. It's just not possible to be conducting surveillance at even the low numbers that the Indian government is openly saying that it conducts, and the actual guess is much higher if you go by what has
Right.
other kinds of stories that have come out of Gujarat, out of Himachal Pradesh, and so on. The actual numbers seem to be much higher than what the union government has suggested in the past. But all of these, it's unclear to me whether the law is being followed, and for me, that's the priority. The law currently, as it exists,
Yeah.
is very probably not being followed. And two, very much of what we have in terms of the intelligence agencies, etc., are completely outside of the law. And so we
Yeah.
need to bring them within the fold of the law to regulate them, to
Yeah.
safeguard privacy.
And frankly, I don't see any of that happening because over the years we've been so accepting almost. It's almost taken for granted that everybody's under surveillance, everybody's hacked. That's how at least journalists, frankly, talk. Sandeep, in the past, if you look at the history of India, Ambassador K.C. Singh will remember this. When governments have fallen on issues of surveillance, right? There was also that time. We all remember what happened with Rajiv Gandhi, for example, and that was for posting two people, two people outside a politician's house. Now, Sandeep, we are not told the names, but we are told that two serving ministers and three opposition politicians are in this list that were sought to be hacked and possibly placed under surveillance. This will, of course, now overshadow possibly Parliament. Government is issuing swift denials, but do you think the government will find itself embarrassingly on the defensive? Or do you think that unless the ministers themselves make noise, not much will happen?
Barkha, let's not be either naive or principled about these things.
What
Surveillance
does
is
that
something.
mean? What does that mean? You're saying we should all just assume that
No,
that,
no,
that,
I
that
mean,
everybody's listening in. It's all
yeah, of
media.
course.
Yeah.
I'll say that, surveillance has been going on. I'm not saying who is doing this surveillance. Okay. We don't yet know that, whether it's the government or somebody, as you said, private. But irrespective of that, surveillance is an age-old thing. It's going on from the times of Chanakya or whosoever you want to call. That's been a part of statecraft, and it's not just limited to governments. It is done today. Industrial espionage is a common thing, and there are agencies, legitimate agencies, providing that. And we were discussing just before the show, Pranesh was saying, it's an often season when lovers appoint somebody to spy on their either husbands or vice versa. We know of these sort of cases from our thing. So these things happen. Secondly, this is nothing new within politics. It's now today in the public domain that ministers in Indira Gandhi's cabinet were known to be CIA moles. And there are names which have been mentioned in declassified documents of ministers whom we held in very high esteem, who were there and in very, very critical junctures of whether it's a 71 a war or other times. That has happened. There was a time, it is now today totally in a public record, when KGB says they had planted more than 17,000 documents in public domain.
But as I said,
so therefore, none of this, let's not pretend to be innocent.
You're saying none of this should shock us. Basically, none of this should shock us.
Of course. And finally, I will say, and I wouldn't get into the legality issue. Edward Snowden and others have blown the myth that even our so-called American society, which talks about so many safeguards and laws, they do nothing. And even after Obama came in, on the back of the allegations which happened before that, if you see the Edward Snowden movie, everything he did, he just kind of papered over it, and things are happening. So I don't think this is really thing. You will have a noise, this sort of thing. Unfortunately, I think while some people think the timing was done for the, coincided, I don't think it is for the monsoon session. I think it's a pity. In fact, it might suit the government to divert the noise in this direction rather than some very major other issues which were going to be taken up in monsoon session. So I think it'll ultimately be.
Hang on. When you say it shouldn't shock us, yes, of course, we all know about corporate espionage. We all know that malware can be used in anybody's devices. But here, the reason that Sumant, that it would make possibly more noise than that is if NSO were to, which is the parent company of Pegasus, were to sort of say we only deal with governments, we only deal with states. One, two, the fact that it includes serving ministers, it references a judge of the Supreme Court, it references three opposition leaders, and those opposition leaders are certainly not going to be silent. I don't know about the ministers. I don't know if the ministers will speak or say very much. They might even come and take the side of the government. But Sumant,
Only one thing I'll say, Barkha,
yeah,
before Suman comes in, just one point.
yeah.
So when I said, espionage or, snooping has been time immemorial from ages, the change which has happened today is technology. And, everybody's using technology. And the more important change is technology is today available to you and me if we want to, whether to
And
pay a
that is the
price.
plausible, and I'll ask Pranesh to explain this later, but Suman, that's the plausible deniability that will always exist, that unless a whistleblower, and you see the Snowden controversy was able to link back that surveillance to official agencies in the United States of America. You will need that to happen here for the government to be put on the map. And we just don't have enough information yet. I don't know if it's going to come in the subsequent stories, who ordered Pegasus. At the moment, we don't have it, right? So
Yeah.
government agencies are going to turn around and say, hey, listen, if these guys were put under surveillance, we have no idea who did it.
Yeah. Now, Barkha, there are two things. As far as what we've heard so far, I think for all practical purposes, just saying that journalists' phones were hacked, I don't think there is a big enough story to really make an impact. Now, for the reasons for that are very clear. I mean, public assume that opposition politicians' phones are under surveillance. I mean, 1988, you remember Ramakrishna Hegde resigned after 51 or 52 people's phones were found to have been tapped illegally. And since then, just in the last 4 or 5 years, I know Andhra Pradesh, Jagannath Reddy's government is accused of tapping phones. In Rajasthan, Gehlot's government is accused of tapping phones. Karnataka, the BJP government is accused of tapping phones. So I think that the public are not going to make a huge distinction between a tapping of a phone and a hacking of a phone. I mean, to us, it may seem a big difference. But I think it is illegal. But the point is, the public, I don't see them reacting with outrage.
Unless you can link it back to government, right? And that is the missing link
No.
so far in the story.
That's not going to be enough, Barkha. I think that you will have to prove somehow that the information which was obtained through the tapping or hacking of these phones was somehow used to either blackmail or bring pressure to bear on those people. That is going to be the real challenge. Tomorrow, let us say NSO comes out and says, they've already issued a statement saying that we don't deal with private players, we only sell to states, we only sell to governments. So now, and they've gone as far as to identify, if I remember right, 45 governments around the world to whom they have sold it. They've not given the names of the government, but they've said the number 45, and they said we don't deal with private parties. So if Pegasus has infiltrated these phones, and now there is incontrovertible evidence that has happened, that means only the government could have done it, assuming NSO is not telling a lie. And of course, the Israeli government can certainly pressure can be brought to bear to get them to say whether they have sold it to others or not. But the point is not that. The point is, tomorrow, if it is established that the government did illegal surveillance of all these people's phones, hacked into them, read their mails, let me tell you, many people in this country will say, so what? And that is the crux of the problem. People assume that this is going on. So you're not going to get the outraged reaction or shock. The reaction will come only, as you rightly said, if the ministers make a noise, if the people in the BJP start to make a noise, if the judge who has not been named so far, we've told that there is the name of one judge, but they've not named him. If the judiciary takes serious notice of this, only then there will be any kind of consequences for the government from this. Just this information that we have today, I don't think they're going to be even worried about.
I just want Pranesh to quickly react to that, and that Tehseen can jump in. Do you think that is the missing link, that the difference between, let's say, Snowden and what happened with American agencies, and even there, by the way, not everybody was on Snowden's side, right? He was eventually pushed into exile. There were enough people who believed the national security made it imperative to have a surveillance system in place. Even in India, privacy has never been upheld as one of those legally enforceable principles. And there I tend to agree with Sumant that, even if we think that in principle it is so wrong that nobody has the right to privacy, without being able to link this back conclusively to government, the government can just wash its hands off it, can't it, Pranesh? Or do you think the answerability is still that of the government?
So let me start off with the last question first. I'm actually quite pessimistic about whether this will lead to reform. We have had instances where, with incontrovertible proof, for instance, in December 2012, the BJP government went out of power, and the day they went out of power in December, the newly elected INC government, they conducted a raid on police stations, and they recovered tons of hard drives where hours and hours of unauthorized, clearly illegal phone surveillance had been recorded. Okay, this was clearly illegal, and the opposition, when it came into power, it discovered this within hours. Yet hardly anyone even knows the story. Okay, it did not lead to many ripples of any kind. And for me, that really is the problem. In 2000, again, we have a story out of Gujarat of a young architect who had been put under surveillance by the anti-terrorism task force. We actually have leaked audio of her being followed around and her phone being put under surveillance. Yet that didn't lead to scalps falling of any kind. So even when we actually do know of with proof of surveillance having taken place, at the highest levels and so on by the highest people, without authorization, we don't see enough of clamor amongst the general public to vote people out of power and so on. Now, having said that, there are two things I'd like to add. One is the situation in 1988 can't be compared to the situation now, because after there was a case brought to the Supreme Court from 93, which was finally in 97, they ruled in PUCL versus Union of India, which put in place legal requirements for surveillance, which was finally passed into law as well by the government. There's Rule 419A of the Indian Telegraph rules, and so on, under Section 5 of the Telegraph Act, and there are rules under the Information Technology Act as well. Those did not exist in the 1980s. Okay, so now there are clear rules and guidelines which the government is bound by, and which the government can be taken up for violating. And hacking is, let me remind you, a criminal offense under the ITM. So if it is shown that there was hacking without proper authorization, and whether such authorization existed,
how will you show it? I mean, who's going to take this upon themselves? This is an endless process. Tehseen, how much of this is going to play out politically in your estimation?
So let's just break it up step by step. One, what Sandeep said, that this has been happening from the times of Chanakya. I mean, as a student of Arthashastra, let me say that that's not democracy, and democracy is an evolving process. I went to the Honorable Supreme Court on Aadhaar, and that is when the Supreme Court diverted from Aadhaar and had a constitutional bench ruled that the right to privacy is a fundamental right. So just because a wrong happened in the past does not justify a wrong in 2021. And I think it is sad to say that, it happened all the time, so it's expected now. Having said that, I agree with what Suman said. Look, some of the government's closest bureaucrats and journalists who praise the government day in and day out and see nothing wrong are the ones who are being spied upon. Now, we should not be surprised, because we all know the story, and I won't take the name of the union minister who was going to the United States when the first time this government was elected, and he got a call from the Prime Minister's office and was told not to go in his jeans, to go back home and change. We all know who that person was. We know that story. It's never been said officially, but we know that story happened, and we know that the government is surveying its own people. So what Suman says, to an extent, is right. And I'll tell you, when I go back and I tell people about privacy, and I'm very proud to have been a part of that process, the first reaction I get from educated people is, but agar aap koi galat kaam nahi kar rahe, to kya dar hai aapko?
Yeah,
So
yeah, but that is a
privacy,
completely facetious argument. But you're right that that is how people respond, because the fact of the matter
absolutely.
is that everybody talks in a certain way if they think they're talking to a friend or someone they know well, or when they think nobody is listening. That doesn't mean that you have deep corruption or black money stashed away or you're part of some conspiracy deal. But what you're right about is that nobody respects somebody else's privacy till their own is violated. Basically, that's what
Yes,
it is
and
in one line.
absolutely. Now, I just want to come to the last part. Look, even if the government has managed to snoop, this is no doubt it's done by the government, that's been done. Even if they've managed to snoop into our phones, the point is, how does the government legally prosecute somebody for this information if they have it? Because for them to prosecute somebody for this information, they have to go back and say how they obtained that information, and that to the government is a challenging part. So, what is the idea of the snooping then? The idea of the snooping, Barkha, is the idea to dominate, the idea to control, the idea to humiliate, the idea to be to be a totalitarian state, to call you up and tell you, I know you're doing this, I can manipulate you say you're doing this. And now we know cases in Bhima Koregaon where false evidence was planted into people's computers. We now are aware of that. So this is a government that's not just totalitarian, it's a government that is vengeful, it's a government that is planting evidences in your computer and calling you an anti-national. That, in my mind, if the Supreme Court does not shake up and does not take the bull by the horns, we can kiss our democracy goodbye. We are no longer a democracy, but we can
Okay,
kiss
let me get
whatever little
Sandeep and
bit we have
Suman.
a goodbye.
Let me get Sandeep and Suman to
I
respond to that.
will say,
Sandeep, yeah,
I'm
Sandeep.
very,
In a
I'm
way,
very,
just one sentence. In a way, I partly agree with the fact that there is something quite brutalized about us as a people when we just shrug our shoulder and say, "Ha, this too happens."
no, I'm
It's
not
an
saying this
unfortunate way to
no, this
respond.
to happen.
Let us
No,
also not
I'm not
forget,
saying this to happen at
just
all.
one more sentence, Let us also not forget that one of the biggest stories of the world, the Jamal Khashoggi assassination, Pegasus has played a role in that. We don't know what role, but it has been used to spy on Khashoggi's wife, among others, a few months before he was murdered. So it should remind us that there are, there are larger motivations, larger conspiracies here where people are placed under surveillance, and maybe it's not correct at all in a democracy for us to be so accepting, so jaded, so cynical about it, as we in the media certainly are.
Absolutely, Barkha. I'm not justifying whether these things should be done or what the implications of it on democracy, etc. Where my problem is, if people like Tehseen suddenly behave that this is happening only today, whereas Mr. Shekhargupta has gone on writing to say how M.K. Narayanan told him openly, do you want me to take out a file on so and so? Why is he becoming so pesky?
No, I
Or,
named the Rajiv Gandhi case in the beginning of the
no,
show.
or Mr. Kapil Sibal says that, shall we put our journalists before you? Or how many journalists we control? So these sort of things happen. I'm not saying, therefore, you accept it, or to say it's happening only in India and under this so-called totalitarian regime who's trying to control everybody, but doesn't happen anywhere in the world. Your biggest poster child of democracy in America, it's happening all the time. So don't pretend that this is not happening. So you rule out one Cambridge Analytica, several others come in. Similarly, tomorrow you call out Pegasus, other Regasus will come in. This is a way of a state of life. And the question which we are debating, I agree with Suman, the only thing if we issue if somebody is arm twisting to blackmail somebody, even in a personal situation, like when we say some lover or a husband snooping on the wife or vice versa, if they're doing it to arm twist and blackmail. But we know of cases when there are senior editors who have got a whole calling list from a service provider and put somebody else on the mat. But let's not pretend that it's today's.
I want to go to Sumant, but briefly, Pranesh. Yeah.
So two quick things. One, even if there's blackmail, and I believe in the Himachal Pradesh case that I mentioned earlier, there was, and nothing still happens. So that for me is ruled out. For me, actual change might happen if the courts get involved and if they really push this hard, and only then, or if the opposition somehow magically manages to make this a really big issue. I know of only 2 politicians in India who've really taken this up, which was former Vice President Ansari and Manish Tiwari of the INC. Other than them, I don't know anyone else who's really pushed for regulation of intelligence agencies in India. One other quick point, we can't compare this to the NSA and so on, because there things were done under a legal framework. That legal framework, the FISA court framework, was reformed specifically in reaction. Things from the Patriot Act were not continued. Those were discarded. And so we actually saw surveillance reform in the US in response to the Edward Snowden revelations. Whether they went far enough or not is a separate debate, but they were meaningful. Okay,
I just want to bring up the government response. It has come. Can we just play that statement, just the operative part of it? And Sumant Tehseen, I'd like you to respond. It's a long statement. The operative part of it says the news report is a fishing expedition and its aim seems to be to malign Indian democracy and its institutions. Sumant Tehseen, and then we'll take last comments. Sumant, yeah. We need to unmute Sumant. Yes.
Why I again reiterate that I don't see this really blowing up in the face of the government. One, as Pranesh said, you will recall of this private, one of the large industrial groups that was actually in the telecom space, who had recorded, who had tapped and illegally recorded huge numbers of phone conversations, and nothing happened. I mean, this is just one industrial group in this country, and nothing happened. There was another case, a former union minister who is now a member of parliament, who was accused of having an illegal telephone exchange in his official residence. And one of the things that was accused, while one accusation against him was that he was transferring data for another company, the other accusation was perhaps this exchange was tapping phones illegally. Again, nothing happened. So if a former union minister who was out of power for almost a decade can get away with it, I don't see any kind of consequences for the government out of this, unless somebody who is in that list of people who has been hacked makes an issue out of it. And I don't mean the journalists. The journalists making an issue is not going to go anywhere.
Yeah, but that's a kind of sad statement, isn't it? Tehseen, let's bring in Tehseen. Yeah, Tehseen's on mute.
I'm unmuted. Yeah. I read the government response, the so-called government response. I don't even know if this is a government response because it's not on a letterhead. It is not signed. It is just a vague statement which my grandmother could have put out, my 5-year-old niece could have put out. I mean, this is the goddamn government of India's response without a letter, without the Ashok stump on it. I want to make a larger point before I end. Look, when we fought the right to privacy, when we got diverted to right to privacy, and thank God for that, the government of India promised in the Supreme Court data protection law. Now, again, that is a part of evolving democracy. That hasn't come in. For example, I'm just diverting slightly. Your Arogya Setu, where is that data gone? Wasn't Arogya Setu supposed to save this country from COVID? Where is that data gone? It has gone, and I'm making this claim with all responsibility to insurance companies that know about your health. Let the government deny it. What I'm trying to say is your personal data is in the control of men who are not oversighted by law. They're not oversighted by any parliamentary committee, and they're not oversighted by the judiciary. And that should frighten us. We cannot go back to Chanakya Niti or cannot go back to the 80s and 90s because, quite frankly, this is something different that is happening, and it's much more dangerous than what happened in the 80s and the 90s.
All right, Sandeep and then Pranesh has the last word. The fact that the list of journalists includes both critics, established critics of the government, and also established, people with, I will at least say, close access to government, makes the pattern difficult to decode, other than what was suggested earlier, that this is a government where even ministers have, at least off record, suggested that every move of theirs is being watched very closely. The politics of it, Sandeep, how do you see it shaping up?
As I'm saying, I don't think the politics is going to, as Suman and all of us seem to agree to some extent, I don't think the politics of this will blow over. Government, if you want to use your favorite term, will brazen it out. All that will happen. because this is nothing unusual. And if I may say so, it's for your fraternity, it may not be such a good thing that the Wire broke it. Okay, Wire has a certain reputation preceding it, and that will have apply
But
a certain.
how is that relevant? It is part of a 16,
No,
whether you agree
it
with it
could be.
ideologically or not, it is part of a 16 outlet
It could
international
be.
media
It's a
project called the Pegasus Project. Whether you like individual
absolutely
journalists there or
no.
not is
No,
irrelevant,
I
right?
don't like it. I'm saying I'm talking in a very, very, shall I say again, I repeat my word, immoral. How will people perceive it? Your ordinary people here are not going to see whether it's an international this thing. They will see who has published it here. Okay, and
Right.
they will say these guys all the time, lambast the government, find something of a fault. So they have also done this. So it can be diluted in many ways. So I don't think the political fallout will be great. But what you are saying, if this generates a dialogue, whether it's a judiciary, whether it's people, and I would once again repeat, let's not be naive to say these have not been happening earlier. This has been happening, whether it's been coming in the public domain or not. But if people like Tehseen, I'm not telling personally, who think they will use this as a whipping stick on BJP, they'll utterly fail. They should
Okay.
probably focus on COVID. They can focus on petrol prices and other more relevant
I
issues.
mean, in some ways, it might be argued that I think you said that it's a distraction that everybody is seeking and needing. Sumant, you wanted to say something here?
Yeah,
I'm seeing
Barka,
your hand up.
just 10 seconds. You see, I had a very interesting conversation with a police officer, senior police officer, on this topic a few years ago. And he told me, look, invariably, the demand is to tap two groups. One is the opposition leaders. Second are the colleagues in the cabinet who cannot be trusted or who are often, quote unquote, and alliance partners. Believe me, he says alliance partners are almost invariably under surveillance. So it's not at all surprising that you got journalists who are actually batting for the government who are also on
Yeah.
this list. That's very much to be expected.
Yes,
Okay.
Suman, I and you should feel very left out if our names are not included there. Then we haven't made the grade as yet,
Yeah, we haven't been
Okay.
published.
You're not important enough. All right, Tesleen, a 10-seconder to you, and then Pranesh closes it. Yeah.
I don't think, while laughing this out, I don't think we understand the magnanimity of this. The government is now right into your bedrooms. Barkha, this is different from two police people outside your house or a car following your car. They are in
Yeah.
your bedroom. They know who you're sleeping with. I'm sorry for being so direct. They
No,
know
no.
who you're exchanging.
Yeah.
They know who you're
Yeah.
having personal conversations. They know what your personal life with your family is like, in the journalist thing with his wife. They know everything. That to me, Barkha, is much more severe than what happened in Chanakya Niti, or what happened in the 70s and the 80s. And to take this lightly is criminal.
But
Yeah.
Tehseen, don't be naive. The bedroom was not safe even earlier. So if you have been operating on that basis, I would.
They now
As
have
an
the
elder,
cameras in your
yeah,
bedroom.
as an
Okay,
elder, I will
I just
advise
can
you
come out of
caution.
these graphics. Can I just want to give the last word to Pranesh? With here's what may explain. Can we come out of this? Yeah, here's what may explain, Pranesh, why there's a sense of resignation. It's also the changing. Tehseen is right. Democracy evolves, and the pursuit of democracy should be to deepen, not to get shallower. But technology is also evolving, and what we do know is today anybody literally can mirror your phone if they so want to and get inside your phones. And there's a kind of Black Mirror, the Netflix series. Everything that seemed weird is actually coming true, and therefore there's a sense of surrender or helplessness vis-a-vis this technology. You
So
don't
I
need
don't
big
think
governments. You don't need big governments anymore to spy on you, right? It can happen anyway. It can happen at the level of corporate espionage. It can happen at the level of your local police station. It can happen at the level of your private detective. And of course, it can happen at the level of government.
for me, I would put the local police station at the level of the government,
Yeah,
at least.
yeah. No, what I
Now,
mean was
I
that it
think
can
at
be a
least
localized
technology,
state intervention or a centralized state intervention. That's all I meant.
because at least under Indian law, your local Thana cannot order interception of your phone conversations or order this kind of under the CRPC, etc. This kind of malware placement cannot be ordered under those laws. as far as my reading of them goes. So that having been said, technology makes it easier for governments to spy remotely at greater distance for longer times. But what really has not, and there's technology that has evolved to counter these abilities as well. But what has not evolved with time in India has been the laws. Okay, and we still can't, I think, acquiesce to a situation where our intelligence agencies are not answerable to the people of India, where routinely we have instances of interception laws being flouted, yet the Gujarat High Court allowed for such flouting, saying it was at the behest of the father of the girl who was being spied upon, as though that has some governmental imprimatur, akin to the Home Secretary. So these kinds of attitudes need to change. The culture around privacy needs to change. And if the government of India is serious that it has no hand to do, it has had no hand in the spying of these journalists who are the fourth estate. And I think it's a scandal that not just government ministers, but for me, it's a bigger scandal if journalists are being spied upon, very frankly. Okay, I realize the general public might not feel that way and so on, but I think it's a true scandal. If the government is serious, then it will take this issue up on a diplomatic level with the Israeli government and ask for accountability from the NSO group. So why isn't it doing so? Is it fine with Indian citizens being spied upon by anyone? Now, the French government took it up. The German government took it up.
Would you consider all journalists are absolutely lily-white? I told you it is now in public domain that more than 1,300 journalists were compromised during the Cold War in India. It has been, it's totally in public domain. It has been written.
The issue, for me, the issue isn't who the target is. For me, the issue is
it doesn't make it okay. No, Sandeep,
whether
it doesn't make it okay.
procedures were followed.
One minute, Sandeep, I think what Pranesh is
cannot
saying.
be immune because you are a journalist. It cannot be.
Hang on. You're mixing up two things, Sandeep. I think what Pranesh is saying is that even if there are journalists who are compromised, to borrow your word, that is something that even that investigation has to take place within the framework of law. You cannot have marauding private agencies from another country swoop in and spy on your citizens. That's it. That's, I think, the point that he's making. If you want to investigate journalists, you think a compromise, do it within the framework of law, right, Pranesh?
I just have one line.
Nobody has.
I have one line. Just one line, please. Please give me one line.
Okay. And then I really have to close.
Sorry, just one line. Let's assume what Sandeep is saying is true. This is not the government of India doing it. It's a foreign entity doing it. That makes India even more vulnerable that your journalist, that your Supreme Court judge allegedly, or your other people are being spied by a foreign country. Therefore, what Pranesh is saying makes it even more relevant that the government of India takes it up diplomatically. So A, is the government of India doing it? And if they're not, they better get on and take this on diplomatically because somebody's spying on Indians. So that's even more dangerous.
I have never said is the government doing it or not.
I'm just trying to figure out.
And precisely that. Therefore, your government should have taken up why KGB and CIA.
This is also my government.
No.
This is also my government. This is also my government and my prime minister.
No.
And my prime minister. He's incompetent, but he's my prime minister.
No, he is very competent, and that's why you are afraid of him.
Okay.
I'm not afraid of
We
nobody.
are going into some completely random direction, Tehseen, Sandeep. Please stop. Please, it's late at night. We need to all go and sleep. Pranesh, literally 30 seconds to you. You believe that whether or not the government disowns, the government already disowned any association with this surveillance if it took place, as has been alleged. It needs to show intent by raising this with Israel and saying, please explain how Pegasus got to do this, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, Pranesh?
Absolutely, 100%, absolutely. In the alternative, it needs to justify why they were put on surveillance, for how long, on basis of what evidence, or on basis of what probable cause they were put under surveillance, and to actually release the authorizations provided by the Home Secretary. and the
Okay.
review,
Okay.
the minutes of the review
Well, the
meeting,
government
etc.
has already denied it in great detail, so that only leaves option one. And I don't know. I have a feeling that that's not going to happen either. If I had to use my political instinct, and I can see someone agreeing, but it's late. We let you all go and enjoy the sort of little that remains of your Sunday. Sandeep, Pranesh, Tehseen, and Suman. Sorry, Ambassador K.C. Singh, you didn't have a great line. So next time, and to our audience, let's see how this plays out in Parliament. Let's see what are the names emerge and how the courts react, because this is a matter that is, I think, going to end up in the courts, and it also allegedly involves one sitting judge of the courts. So that should be interesting to watch. So see you tomorrow. More on this story tomorrow. For now, good night and have a great weekend. It's great to see you here. Thank you for watching our work. If you haven't subscribed yet, don't forget to click the bell icon and subscribe to Mojo Story and support independent, robust journalism.